The tales of the Primarchs are as myriad as the very stars. Their exploits, their abilities, their armies, their impact on the great galactic stage, their execution of the Great Crusade, their involvement in the heresy of HORUS HERESY, the War Master, his bloody rebellion against his own father, all in the name of unclean evil entities of the warp. Yet there are so many competing ideas, fables and parables of the acts of those times, that often things are missed. Their import occluded by the onward rush of events, their significance drowned out by the clangor of unfettered war. And thus, I intend to throw back the curtain to reveal a dark moment, a terrible loss to the Imperium, one that was never given its due. For it was the greatest crime, the most devastating of blows. So, gentle listener, if you join me now on this dark sojourn into the past, we shall needs witness some of the most terrible acts of those times, and we will witness the one most heart-wrenching moment to grace the pages of the Black Library. The end of not one, but two Primarchs in the same moment, the same scene, one after the other. Upon the fields of the Urgal Depression, upon the site of the legendary Drop Site Massacre. And I shall show to you the man few see, the being few understand. For today, we shall discuss one of the greatest of the sons of the Emperor, the master of mankind, one of his brightest lights. And if any refute this assertion, if any dare gainsay, then I state that my opinion is backed up not only by Malcador, the hero, and the Council of Terror, but by the greatest of all Primarchs, the War Master himself, HORUS HERESY. So, come with me, gentle listener, and let me introduce you to one of my favorite tales, the sorrow, the tragedy, of the sullying of the most excellent and most gifted of all of the Legiones Astartes. Welcome to the fall of the Primarch of the Third Legion and his sons, the Emperor's children. Welcome to the tale of the Palatine Phoenix, Fulgrim. It is the 31st millennium, the time of the Great Crusade. The Emperor of Mankind has reunified Terra, the cradle of humanity, and leads his armies out into the stars. He has 20 legions of his Adeptus Astartes, his genetically enhanced warriors, his space marines. Each of these legions is taken from the pattern of 20 different templates, 21 if you include the twins, Alpharius and Omegon, of the Alpha Legion. These templates are the apex of the Emperor's craft, both genetic and mystic, and they are called his Primarchs. But in the last moments before their maturation, before their effective births from their gestation pods, they are flung out across the galaxy by the machinations of the dark gods of chaos and the duplicity of a mother who does not trust the goals and methods of the father. For it was Erda that had a large part in the diaspora of the Primarchs, but that is for another day, another time. Each of the Primarchs was sent to planets with populations, with centers of humanity. Odd but true. For there was method in the madness of the great enemy, the powers of chaos. So each grew up and matured among lesser civilizations. Backwater worlds usually denuded of the technology that brought them into the stars in the first place. Hence they grew to become leaders of their worlds in all cases but the one. For the Primarchs were beings of titanic size, Herculean strength, of both sinew and appetite. They were intelligent beyond the realms of most baseline humans, and tantamount to immortal. They did not age, not by any measurement used by humans at any rate. And they were sponges for information, soaking in everything around them, existing on a completely different level to those around them. Only amongst themselves, their own kind, the Primarchs or the Emperor himself, could any of them come close to being able to state that they had met a kindred soul, a capable mind. They were that separated from us, the normal humans, that they were created to save. And so it was that Fulgrim was like the others. His capsule was sent out into the void, and it landed on a backwater world, a dying world. For the planet of Chemos was his destination, and it was shattered by the past, fearful of the future. Once a mighty hub of commerce, the land was choked and blasted, subterranean realms being the only way to carry on existence. But the technological marvels that permitted the formation of the conurbations was long lost to the sands of time, and the cities were contracting year by year. For it was an industrial world once a long time ago, each of its mining facilities producing enough excess to be sold for the things they could not produce themselves, the most important of all goods, food and water. Yet despite putting in draconian rationing, a harsh rule toward any who could not contribute, despite their entire population working from dawn to dusk and then later, literally working until they dropped of exhaustion, still they were being defeated. For each year there was less surplus. Each year more of their equipment became inoperable, as none remained who could fix them. Each year less they could trade. Thus each year their economy contracted and shrank. Entire subsectors had been closed one after another, as the people to maintain them were gone, starved. They had become uneconomical to maintain, and each year the creeping stagnation took its toll. Or it did, until the coming of Fulgrim. His pod had smashed through the atmosphere and come down near one of the main facilities. A scouting party found it and him, a large and perfect child with magical eyes that saw into the soul of all who met them, a shock of silver hair over an angelic face. Yet then it was the custom, the ration system, which meant that he should be put down immediately. All orphans were terminated on Chemos, without any way to contribute immediately. The community could not support them. So they were exposed, or simply done away with then and there. But for some reason, the leader of this band, he took pity on the young Primarch. Or perhaps he was affected by the perfect child somehow, which I find more likely. But whatever the reason that tugged on the heartstrings of this man, he took the Primarch into his home, fed him, clothed him, taught him all that he knew. And Fulgrim matured at a preternatural rate, as did all of his kind. Within scant years, he was able to take up duties in the mines and factories that were done by people twice or thrice his age. And as he matured further, he could work for days on end, shifting and moving many times that of any other. He was a legend even in his youth. But more than this, the feats of strength and endurance were as nothing to the works of his mind. Self-taught through observation alone, Fulgrim learned the mechanisms of the mines, the factories. He then understood them. And he went on to not only fix those that had broken down, but to increase the efficiency of those in operation. And in a few scant decades, Fulgrim had utterly dominated the entire planet, for he had risen again and again, his skills and abilities outshining any on the planet by factors. He metamorphosized the planet in this time, for he created such efficiency, such productivity, that trade bloomed again. And with his power, he then opened up one mine and facility after another. One person now able to perform the tasks of many due to his innovations and repairs. But this was still not all. Still not the totality of his vision, his breadth of perspective. As the planet increased in productivity, Fulgrim then passed off some of those who would normally have worked, those whose skills were far better deployed elsewhere. For Fulgrim pulled the entire culture up. He endorsed and patronized not only scientists, explorers and entrepreneurs, but also musicians, artists, writers and sculptors. He wished to return Chemos not only to sustainability, but to exalt the human soul, to bring back those things which truly made us great, the arts. Yet as this forward march to a utopia was on track, it was then that the seclusion of Chemos was brought to an end. For it was then that the crusade reached Chemos. It was then that the Emperor himself arrived to claim his errant son. And Fulgrim was the fifth found of them all, one of their first. And thus, when all others were subsequently discovered, it was Fulgrim that was one of their seniors. Or he would have been. The world of Chemos had no formal military, just peacekeepers who worked for the establishment. So Fulgrim sent them to meet the beings who came from the skies in ships clearly made for war, for intimidation. Yet, when they were led into the presence of the Lord of Chemos, Fulgrim saw the Emperor in the entourage, detected him. And he climbed from his throne and walked to the Emperor. And without quibble or quandary, without hesitation, he simply knelt and offered his sword to the master of mankind. Fulgrim and Chemos had been returned to the Imperium, and he would lead his own army, his own legion of space marines. But there was an issue. Fulgrim had been cheated by fate, his grand destiny snatched away from him. For his legion did not exist. Not really. He was a lord without vassals, a general without an army. And this, I believe, is what cracked his heart. A small slither that was all that evil needed to seep in. How his heart must have broken. To be the inheritor of nothing but a name and a potential, while others inherited vast arrays of men with accolades and accomplishments already heaving from their banners. Fulgrim was thwarted by fate, utterly. Like all of the early found Primarchs, Fulgrim was tutored by the Emperor himself for a time. And yes, was taken back to Holy Terror, and witnessed its splendor, the glory of it. Everything he had hoped for, everything he had envisioned, it was here, in the Imperium, in the Great Crusade. He learnt of many things, art, philosophy, oratory, and military tactics. He was to be a warlord. But after witnessing the armies of his brothers, after his eyes had drunk in the vast splendor of a reunified terror, his expectations raised to the high heavens. It was then that his dream was dashed, for he met his legion. The Emperor took him. They stood before great doors, the son prepared to meet the army his father bequeathed him, and the doors opened, slowly, loudly. And Fulgrim must have been so expectant, his heart's in his throat. he walked forward, seeing the front ranks of his marines, his very own Astartes, his genetic sons. But then, as he ascended the podium, walked forward, and his eyes became accustomed to the light, the reflections from their polished and buffed parade best shining armor, he looked out, not believing what he saw. His eyes widened, then closed slowly in understanding. For he saw hundreds of men, lined and columned. But that was it. He looked past them to empty spaces, echoing chambers where they should have stood, as far as even his enhanced eyes could see. His legion did not exist. Imagine the pain, the desolation Fulgrim must have felt. His brothers had armies, fleets, tens of thousands under their control, all ready to be shaped, honed by their returned father into the ultimate expression of their purpose. Yet here was he and his legion. They did not exist. But people see this as a selfish thing. His pride was bruised. I think it is not that simple. Not nearly that simple. Or selfish. Fulgrim took on this weight immediately, but he did not mourn the ability to compete. Not entirely. Not then. It was the lack of a way to contribute to the best of his abilities. His impact, the good he could do, would always be diminished. His light always slightly obscured, dimmed. The Fulgrim I believed him to be, he would have wept for his inability to fulfill his potential. The others, his brothers, would have to fight harder because he could not take his place in the line. Their sons would die more because he could not be there to help them. The salvation of humanity itself was delayed, or due to chance, for he could not show the others how it could be done better, not without an army of his own. Yet he faced this bitter blow with such gusto, with such effort, such vision, that he made a believer of the Emperor himself. He converted the Lord of Humanity. For Fulgrim addressed his men, his mere 2 companies, as if the vaults were filled to the rafters. He extolled their future as if they were 1,000,000 strong. He painted a pathway of excellence, endeavor, and honorable duty that filled all who heard it with zeal. And ever after, the Emperor had faith in Fulgrim and his elite force. The Emperor's children, he called them, for none others were as close as he. None. And they would be alone in the right to wear the Emperor's aquila, his sign. That he had chosen them to wear his sigil, the honor was not just a reward, it was a gauntlet, a challenge. Could Fulgrim hone his men into the vision he had shared with his scant companies? A worthy challenge. One he leapt at and grasped with both hands. They would be the best. Of this he swore. Quality, until they too had the quantity. He would build the best legion ever to grace the armies of the Imperium. And so, he set about it. Now the reason for the numbers was simple. There had been a corruption of their gene seed, one so prolific that it had destroyed the entire crop. Hence the growth of more was taken from the marines that existed. Scant few. There was little hope for the formation, and they had been relegated to training the solar auxilia before they were sent across the stars. This changed when their template returned. Fulgrim literally saved his legion, as did Magnus later. From him, they took the samples that would permit the resurrection, phoenix-like, from the ashes. The gene techs went to work, and very soon new recruits were being formed and sent to him from both Terra and his home world of Chemos. Yet the cultural difference between the 2 recruitment zones could not be more different. The Emperor's Children was an apt name for multiple reasons, you see. Not just because of what Fulgrim had done and said. The few remaining Terrans of the Legion had been taken from the offspring of defeated warlords and their barons. They were as much hostages as anything to those outside of the Legion. But there is no man so fanatical, so loyal. as he who was once an enemy but has now seen the light, a convert. Thus they were seen as one of the most fanatically loyal and aggressive about this. Only the word-bearers would outshine them in this regard. But because of their loyalty, their odd pedigree, they were also seen as the best ambassadors of the Emperor. They were to be the epitome of the Marine, ardent, loyal, disciplined, and living lessons, living lights. Not only in the might of his arms to have defeated their parents, but also might of method and reason, of cause. For the sons of the Emperor's enemies now knelt in his presence, followed in his grand crusade. They were trained and deployed as such early on, but as their lack of replenishment took hold, after the destruction of their gene seed, they just faded down to the scant few hundred that now were a dying breed, only used as a shining example to the solar auxilia. The recruits from Chemos were awed by the Primarch far more than his Terran sons. They had served with the Emperor, lived on Terra. Their loyalty would always be to the master of mankind first and foremost. The sons of Chemos were loyal to the godlike man who had changed their world, had been raised amongst them, understood them, had saved their entire world from a slow death. He was like a god to them. For, as he was meant to do, ever did Fulgrim raise all around him up. But as the main recruiting word of the Emperor's children, soon the Marines coming from Chemos outnumbered those coming from Terra. Also, an important point as we progress. Even though this explosion in numbers was fast, it was not enough to make him an army overnight. So the Emperor's children were seconded to the expedition fleets of the first found and most beloved Primarch, HORUS HERESY. And Fulgrim and he formed a fast friendship, for they had the same dream. Perhaps different ways of achieving it, different perspectives on how it should be executed, but they were unified in this vision. Horus was known to state as his guiding light, we, the Imperium, should always leave a place better than we have found it. Yet I think Fulgrim was made of even better stuff. His was a goal that outshone this guiding light. For this is how he put his goal, his credo. I came from nothing, he said, fixing his sons with a steady gaze. I scrabbled in the quarry pits and down at the deepest mines, carrying buckets on my shoulders because the ascender blew a gasket, he said. I broke my fingernails on raw ore and grew blisters from heat and labor. You look down on them, blind to the beauty of their struggle, blind to what they might become if only someone would scrape the filth from their faces. He reached down and lifted a child onto his shoulders. The girl laughed and clapped, unafraid of the giant, even as her mother wept. Fulgrim indicated the crowd. His voice had driven many of them to their knees. Look at them, my sons. You are the highest, and they the lowest. It is your duty to raise them up, as high as they will go. Anything less is not worthy of you. End quote. And so, Fulgrim served with Horus and his lunar wolves, and Horus was always lavish in his praise of Fulgrim and his legion. They were small, but they were elite. He even went so far as to confirm that he thought them the best he had ever served with. Many put this off to Horus buttering up Fulgrim, trying to get his hooks into him early. Yet this, I think, is another case of seeing things forward, projecting that which we know of the future onto the past. For Horus did not get his hooks into anyone. He did not need to then. He would not dream of doing so, because he was loyal then. Until Davin, until the intervention of the Chaos Guards, until the betrayal of Erebus, he was beyond reproach, and he stated this compliment without reservation or secrecy. And, if one reads the lore as I do, then he was right. The Emperor's children were the best. There can be no other conclusion. Yet being the best elite force was still no match to the honor of leading their own expedition of the Crusade. And long was it in the coming. In that time, Fulgrim was as good as his word, as good as his speech that fine day before the Emperor. He built the best legion out there. They were drilled to perfection of fire and formation, deployment and devastation. He took a personal hand in the design of his mighty flagship, the Gloriana-class battleship, the pride of the Emperor. It was vast, and its halls expansive, not only for training and accommodation, but for display of art and repositories of knowledge, culture, and enlightenment. It was a terror in battle, and a floating palace of the void when in recline. Some say that only the Emperor's own flagship, or that of later Dawn, the Phalanx, would best his masterpiece vessel. So when it was finally time, when his men had gained in number to such an extent that they were able, they formed their own expedition. And all was ready, all was paired, all was as good as any could possibly have made it. Fulgrim and his Emperor's children were finally able to wage war. And what a war he chose. Impossible, some said. Improbable, many remarked. A campaign that would be drenched in blood was the only possible outcome. Yet Fulgrim chose it without hesitation. Yet few understand why. They fall to the basic interpretation that is given. They say it is mere pride, hubris, that made him take this path, shout off his mouth, writing a check his men could not pay. They call it childish. But this, I feel, is utterly unfair. For it forgets that the Primarchs, despite their abilities, were still in some part human, and they felt as humans feel. Fulgrim had been working under others, supporting, assisting, for decades now. His men were being super sub almost. Those who are most welcomed when they support another unit or formation. The popularity of the Emperor's children amongst the legions was well known, but it was also felt by all of the supporting formations. Of all the Primarchs, it was only Reboot who seemed to care more for the attached baseline human soldiers in his fleet. Fulgrim had them trained as well to excellence, was wary of deploying them, for he truly was one of the best Primarchs. He wanted to show his brothers not what he could do. He wanted to show them what they could do to improve. He wanted to be an example. I'm sure of this. And that is exactly what he was made to do. Yet still, in Fulgrim I see a great man, a Primarch who, as I said, wished to push his own boundaries, but not for ego, because I believe he saw himself not as a star to be followed. No. I think he saw himself as grabbing the very tethers of human culture and gathering them, putting them over his shoulder, and then trudging forward into the deep snow of ignorance and fear. He was a wayman, a pathfinder, and he would drag all of humanity up with him. He rose so he could pull everyone up, every man, woman, and child. In this, perhaps he was the greatest of his father's sons. In this aspect, so much like Sanguinius, so much like his friend Horus, so much as well like the old Gorgon, Ferrus Manus. I believe each Primarch had their uses, their role. Some built, some fought, some led. Some were examples, or so I believe. Where Dawn was to build the Imperium's walls, Perturabo and Guilliman its roads and highways, Horus its armies, and Alferis its intelligence. Hence I believe that Sanguinius and Fulgrim were cut of the same cloth. I believe they were to be examples. For Fulgrim was the perfect ambassador. Now some say that Lorgar would fill this place. But all of the Primarchs had redundancies, so to put it. And I believe that his own Primarch ability, as some call them, was a charisma almost as palpable as that of Horus or Sanguinius, but of a slightly different order, a different level one might say, but no less potent. For many deride and underestimate Fulgrim, looking at what he became. I believe he was secretly one of the greatest of them all. And Horus Lupercal, the War Master, and the Council of Terror agree with me. And here, gentle listener, is why. The Lair Campaign. The Great Crusade was not a mindless, structureless attack in all directions. It surged out, indeed, but there were times when it would circumvent a hard target if its destruction would take too many resources and prevent the expansion. In other words, there were some nuts that they went around and put on a list for the future. The Lair Empire was one such hardpoint. A realm only a single system in scope, one inhabited planet, yet it was seen as a huge problem. Because an exploratory scout fleet had encountered them and been butchered. The entire fleet lost to the last man, and the Lair had lost not one single ship. It was deemed that their technology was such, their forces such, that they would be a major combatant. It was estimated that the extermination of the Lair would require 3 whole legions, millions of auxiliary forces, fleets of ships, and possibly even years to conclude. It was, effectively, out of the reach of the Imperium if they were to maintain their outward rush across the stars. There was even talk of the race being permitted protected status, a non-aggression alliance, a protectorate within the Imperium, with hopes of trading the technology that had made them so formidable. It was indeed a different time. There are a few of these regions, these pocket empires to come back to in the future, but very few. Yet despite this, the sheer impossibility of the task, this would be the first real test of the new 28th Expeditionary Fleet, the personal armada of Fulgrim. The transports for his Emperor's children to take their righteousness, their skill, unto the stars. The Lair were snake-like people, with 2 pairs of arms at the top of their torso, just below their snake heads. Yet they were lithe and nimble, moved with a preternatural fleetness, and an oddness that bent the minds of those who saw them, those who fought them. And their sound-based weapons caused confusion, nausea, and shattered bones, exploded organs, just as advanced as the Marines they fought. Their world was entirely covered in water, but they had created floating land masses, atolls, that glided through the skies above the eternal waves. Their anti-gravitic tech was superior even to the Imperium's. Their warriors almost impossible to break, predict, or take down easily. Much is made of the casualties that were taken. Fulgrim often called a braggart who traded the lives of his men for the petty coin of pride and glory. But I feel again, this is unfair. Perhaps Fulgrim could have moved with more caution, been more careful, spent the lives of his men for greater cost, but it is near impossible to tell. Perhaps Fulgrim knew that the only way to perform this war was to use the tactics of his big brother, HORUS, to fight horrifically so that one fights for as short a period as possible. But this was not against humans who would not bend the knee. This was against Xenos' enemies of humanity. And they were putting up the fight of their lives. Yet despite the casualties being high, very high for some legions, the result was the same, and it is no less grand due to its realization. For the campaign that should have taken 3 legions, taken years if not decades, he and his sons had done in months. They had done it alone, and they had done it in record time. The piffling sneering of others at his casualties utterly ignores this most important of factors. For it is always easy to say, I would do it better here or there or in total. Yet none of the other legions of Primarchs had chosen this task, and I honestly believe there is not one of them that would have done it better. Not one. Alas, it was this first campaign that immediately led to the downfall of the Primarch, and in his fall he carried all of his sons with him, and the hope of the crusade was diminished, nearly as badly as if it had been the angel who had turned. Surely the pain of losing Horus was worst, but to lose Fulgrim, that too must have elicited its own dagger in the heart of the Emperor. I honestly believe that. The last battle of the campaign was to be its most bloody, but it was to lead to their doom. On the last atoll of the last region, the capital of Leren itself, there the end came. The largest and best defended atoll was assaulted from all sides by the Emperor's children, their Primarch at their front. The lair fought so hard that they near repulsed the Marines, but eventually the suicidal charges and traps began to slow, then to stop. As the company surged towards the central area, they wiped out all in front of them. The Primarch at the head of his personal hand-picked elite Phoenix Guard swept forward into the last central amphitheatre. At the furthest reaches was a temple. A strange sound, like a horrid twisted music, came from it, the air thick with narcotic smog, pouring from its roof and doors. Fulgrim and his marines went inside, and they witnessed an alien ceremony. The huge open hallway was filled with this music to eardrum-piercing volumes, the air so thick with stimulants that they could barely see. The last remaining lair seemed ignorant of the newcomers, writhing on the floors in huge carpets, all insensate with pleasure from their copulation and the narcotics in the air. The Marines went forward, shooting into the masses of the things. They offered no resistance whatsoever, as the Emperor's children walked forward and hacked them to pieces instead. While all of this occurred, Fulgrim looked around. He saw the dizzying murals of colours so bright and intense that it hurt the eyes, the sensibilities. Added to the sounds, the very structure created to resound with them, and amplify them both internally and externally. It was a bacchanal scheme taken to the extremes beyond normal human conception. All of this occurred under the watch of a huge bull-headed yet bipedal statue, and in the centre of this writhing congregation of perverts, in the centre of the place of debauched worship, suspended on a perfect plinth, was a simple silver sword, but beautiful and elegant in the sweep of its lines. And the Primarch was drawn to it, not knowing of chaos or demons or curses, believing with every fibre of his being in the imperial truth. Fulgrim simply reached out to take the sword, to look at it at first, but as soon as his hand touched that blade, skin to metal, contact had been made. It had a way in. For he grasped it with purpose, only a nanosecond later, raising it up and knowing that he would take it from this place. It was his now, and soon the merest thought of being parted from it would hurt him. For it was cursed. It was infused with a power and threat that Fulgrim could never understand then, could not have accepted even existed. For his father, the Emperor, had kept all of his sons blind, utterly in the dark, to one of the universal truths of the Milky Way galaxy. He had lied about the existence of gods or demons. He had dissembled, and he had distracted, avoided, and evaded. He had let his sons go about the universe without the basic knowledge of what they were actually up against. For he knew. He always knew. The Emperor could not have made the Primarchs without their assistance, without knowledge he stole from the gods themselves. He just did not tell his sons, not even they, and in this he was in error. Some say that he has been playing an endless game of four-dimensional chess with each and every one of the gods of chaos. That he is as important a player in the great game as any of the dark gods. That he knew that some of his sons would turn to chaos. That he depended on it. That it was all part of his plan. Yet still, it was the error that left the gates unguarded. For the Primarchs could not defend against that which they were specifically told was not even there. They could not discern the influence of chaos, of demons, of evil, as they were indoctrinated into believing that it could never ever exist. And it was their father who had told them this. It was the master of mankind who had made them the way they were, trained them in all he deemed they should know, and identifying and protecting them against the corruption of chaos was not something he deemed they should know. An open mind is like a fortress with its gates unbarred and unguarded, as the quote goes in the grim darkness of the far future, and the heresy proves it to be true. For Fulgrim did not know what was happening to him, could not know, and thus the trap of the imperial truth was made manifest, as I have said before, for the Emperor was trapped within his own lie, unless, of course, it was all as he had designed, he and Malcador, but that is for another time entirely. So Fulgrim was in possession of a weapon that contained a demon, and it slowly slunk its tendrils into his mind and soul. But more than this, the entire force that had gone into the temple had come out changed. And worse still, the Primarch permitted the remembrances within his fleet, one of the few to welcome them at all, to go to the surface to view said temple, to witness its music, to hear its song, to view its images, and it tore their minds to pieces. Alas, it was not immediate, or perhaps others would have been able to see the change, to somehow staunch the infection. But it was not so. The music of the Lair temple haunted their ears, even when waking. The vibrant colours unhinged the minds of those more visual in their medium. All attempted to copy the sounds or colours that they had witnessed, yet they could not do so with the tools at their command. The colours were not bright enough, the sounds from standard musical instruments not deep or expansive enough. And so they went about creating their own tools, their own methods of emulating what they experienced. And those who went to the palace, be it mortal remembrances or the Astartes who took the place or guarded it later, they all descended into hell. For their minds and hearts could not take the sensory stimulation that they had been exposed to, for it was of chaos. All of it was a vast monument to the Prince of Pleasure, to Slaanesh, and the lair blade that Fulgrim took was dripping with its influence. The demon contained within, it subtly changed Fulgrim, but it radically altered his legion at a rate he did not notice, due to the influence of the blade. It was all-pervading, and soon, so tragically soon, the Emperor's children descended into madness as well. They had been cursed by Slaanesh. It now had them all in its sights. And what a triumph that must have been, to take Fulgrim. Surely only the War Master and the Angel Sanguinius were more sought after by evil. But as I said, it was not obvious, and it was not immediate. The rot crept and crept, slowly by slowly, helped along by the warrior lodge that infected the Emperor's children from the lunar wolves and Horus. But it was Erebus and the word-bearers secretly behind it all. They who had snuggled it in within the breasts of the lunar wolves before any others. The creep of the rot. Fulgrim had a second chance. He had many. But he took none of them, because he could not see what he and his legion were becoming. The first was perhaps the strangest of meetings in the entire period. Fulgrim was changing. His senses were overactive, his sensibilities even more so. His expedition discovered a region of planets that were beautiful beyond belief. The clean air, the seas of lush green grasses, the trees and natural animal life, so beautiful to him. Untouched, unsullied, perfect. The worlds were perfect. And Fulgrim and those who had been to the temple on Lair would bask in their panoramic vistas, their harmonious balance. One after another should have been catalogued, marked and allotted, the details sent back to the Imperium. They were lush and verdant worlds. Yet Fulgrim and those now closest to him, they wiped the memory banks. They hid the worlds. It was more than passing odd, especially for Fulgrim of all Primarchs. But this showed some form of kindred to others who were shadowing his exploration fleet. Sleek ships of ancient design skirted the fleet of the Emperor's children, waiting, watching. Now, seeing his clemency, his appreciation of the beauty the universe was capable of, the Eldar made contact. They arranged to meet with Fulgrim on a world in his path, another perfect planet, a wonder. But this was no coincidence at all, for each of this cluster of worlds had long ago been terraformed by the Eldar. They called them Maiden Worlds, and the Eldar considered them theirs. That they were the homes of the generations of Eldar yet to be born to a new Eldar empire. It was no small thing that the humans were here, but it was no small thing that they had left them untouched either. So the arrangement was made, and a small delegation of men went with their Primarch Fulgrim to meet with the Eldar embassage on the maiden world of Tarsus. The Farseer, much younger then, still on the rise, but he was mighty enough to have the guardianship of a legendary race lord called Kieran Goldhelm. It was Eldred Uthran, and he wished to parley with Fulgrim. This was one of the first non-violent meetings with the Eldar, and with a son of the Emperor no less, for the Eldar Farseer, a mystic psyker, leader and prognosticator, ever throwing their vision into the warp to see the patterns as they emerged, the futures that could occur, the best way to manipulate them to their benefit. But they met as dignitaries of their species, Fulgrim and Eldred. Alas, it went badly, for the Eldar thought their view of reality unquestionable, the knowledge they had irrefutable, that it should be taken on face value as the wisdom that it was. Alas, Eldred has never understood humans, Primarch or no, and when he volunteered to Fulgrim that his brother, his friend, Horus, stood poised to betray the Emperor, the Crusade and humanity, all to some mad idea of monsters in the warp, the hectic but harmless dimension they travelled through with every ship. It landed like a punch in the gut to Fulgrim, who went to take the head of the mage when the huge Wraith Lord belied his size with lightning-quick reactions, blocking the Primarch. Eldred then saw the truth. He recognized the demon blade when so close, for he knew that Fulgrim had already been lost. Perhaps he did not know it himself, was not aware, but the dark whispers of the blade had already begun to take hold. And the rage that Fulgrim felt was not just natural, the duty of brother to brother, nor just outrage that the greatest Primarch should be besmirched by a filthy, lying alien, a Xeno. It was also enhanced by the rage of the thing that was inside the layer blade, the thing that made Fulgrim go into a near berserk frenzy as he tore the Wraith Lord to pieces. The rearguard action of Kieran the Goldhelm performed its purpose, as Eldred retreated to a nearby webway portal intact. But as he neared it, Fulgrim in pursuit, the thing flashed and more Eldar appeared from the slash in reality. But amongst them, towering over the rest, its sinews sizzled as it burned the air around it, the fire pluming from its head, its eyes and teeth as white-hot lava. It was colossal in size, the avatar of Cain, a shard of the elder god of war and murder. And they met in open arms, the avatar and Fulgrim. The being threw its spear, its wailing doom, but nothing stopped this enraged son of the Emperor, and the two fought like titans. But it ended with the beast being strangled by the Primarch, his fists clenching into its throat and tearing it out, so its molten blood poured across the ground. It died, and the last of the Eldar with it, on the blades and bolters of the few remaining of Fulgrim's bodyguard. They had taken a vicious toll of their own. Yet the Farseer escaped into the webway and back to his fleet, and they retreated away from the enraged human expedition. Fulgrim then went on a rampage. He virus-bombed each of the worlds he had before left untouched. He wiped the maiden worlds of all life, destroying countless millennia of development. But why? Because he knew. Deep down he knew. The whispering in his head, the change in his views, the distraction of it all. The voluptuous tastes and experiences he before took for granted did not permit himself to exult in. He was becoming, and he knew it. Yet he was so vulnerable to it. Most believed that this was because of his narcissism, that he was a nothing. And I cannot disagree more. He was a voyager, as I've said. And he wished to test all of the boundaries of human existence now. He had thrown off some limiting thoughts, outdated mores and social conventions. He and the Astartes, even the artists in his expedition, they were not only exploring outer space, but the depths of the human soul, its expression, its inherent drive for perfection. And in this way, it was not so far removed from that which he had been made to do. Like his brothers, he had a purpose, and his way was to be an icon, an ambassador, and he was to inspire. So he thought he was treading tracks previously untrodden, for the betterment of all, at least. That would have been his viewpoint, had he not already been weakened by the thing that now coiled itself around his heart and made a fog in his mind. The demon of the layer blade. It now ruled him. But it was not a fall without its steps, for there were many more to come. It is now I make good on my assertion, the illusions I made in my first moments, for here is where we see the validation. The lair defeated, the Legion moved on. A secret message was received, and it was from Terra itself, but not from the Emperor. It was from the new civilian, mortal Council of Terra, Malcador and his hand-picked cronies. Little men doing little jobs. They were petty bureaucrats, according to the Primarchs. But they sent word to Fulgrim that he was to go to investigate the War Master. That he was to investigate the rumors that Horus had been given the World Eaters too much leeway, had used them like a mad dog, and that he was perhaps straying from the true path his father had expected of him. So they sent Fulgrim. Fulgrim snuck up on his brother, the legendary general and warlord, the intimidating Horus Lupercal, and he had him dead to rights. In his sights and utterly unnoticed, Fulgrim stood on the bridge of the Pride of the Emperor, and here another chance came, another moment, but he missed it. For as he looked at the armada of Horus, he recalled the words of the Elder. The depths the emissary had said Horus would plunge the universe. He would burn it all. And Fulgrim hesitated. He could end it right now, before any of it had started. He could just order his fleet to open fire, and it would be over. At that moment, he did not have the layer blade on him. For one reason or another, he had not wielded it or even caressed it, held it or worn it in some days, and his mind, for that fleeting moment, was clearer, and he saw his chance. He could save all of humanity from the worst war imaginable. With but one word, it could be over. But that is when his deck officer, one of his closest aides, brought him the blade. Alas, Fulgrim was so ensorcelled by the blade, by the demon within it, that when it was offered, his hand automatically went out to take it, even as his lips parted and he stated he did not recall asking for it. His moment passed. The sword was back with him. Its influence then took over again, and he attached it to his hip. And he ordered the fleet to send greetings and move out of the blind spot of Horus's formation. The chance, another chance, had gone. But there was one more to come. Not here, but on the fields of Isstvan. Fulgrim had ever been closest with his best friend, the Gorgon, Ferrus Manus, one of the earliest found also loyal to the core. The two seemed like such opposites on the scales that their friendship made total sense. How this we shall discuss in a moment. But it must be said that of all of Fulgrim's other brothers, he loved Sanguinius as much as any, but his first choice would always have been Horus. He had fought under Horus for decades, knew his approach, his honor, his way of doing things. Fulgrim respected him like they all did. He was the first found. He was the closest and deepest in the Emperor's council. He was their big brother. And Fulgrim and he were close. He did not worship Horus, as so many of the later found Primarchs did. His was a friendship of equals, or so he thought. When Horus was the victor of the Alanor campaign, had personally intervened to save the Emperor from the Orc warboss, then was raised up above his brothers, was made first among equals. He was named the War Master. Unlike so many others, Fulgrim was not jealous. He was happy for his brother, as Rogel had been. Fulgrim was competitive with his brothers for so many reasons, but mostly it was small lesion syndrome. So he ever overcompensated, and his brothers called him out, often brutally candidly. But he was never sneered at by Horus. Lupercal knew his worth, and the worth of his men. They were the best. Horus was the most charismatic of all the Primarchs. He also knew how to talk to Fulgrim. And so, while the demon of the Lair Blade suppressed the emotions of Fulgrim, the urges of loyalty and honor and honesty, love of their father and all humanity, the demon prepared the ground. Horus then planted the seeds of sedition, and they grew fast. The War Master claimed that he had discovered that the Emperor would do unto the Marines and the Primarchs as he had done unto the Thunder Warriors. That the Council of Terror, made up of overstuffed shirts and incompetents, would rule when they were gone. For the plan was for the Marines to conquer the galaxy, then to be wiped out. Put on a pyre so that the Emperor could ascend to being a god. A god that would be worshipped by the entire human race and would rule the galaxy that the Marines had won for him for all eternity. The Emperor had betrayed them, and he had lied to them. He would discard them, just as he had already done by retreating to Terra to tinker on nobody knew what. He had not trusted them enough to say. And Horus knew how to manipulate Fulgrim, for he claimed that the Emperor was not perfect, did not deserve the loyalty of others, as he was not perfect. Thus, Fulgrim owed him nothing, that only through the assistance of the gods of chaos could Fulgrim gain this state of perfection. The gods that Horus had met, the gods that the Emperor had met, and then denied even existed. He had lied to his people, his Astartes, but even to his generals, his sons, his Primarchs. He did not trust them with the knowledge. He did not trust them with the choice, his way or theirs. For the Emperor knew that his way was cursed, and the way of the gods of chaos was the truth of the galaxy. It was the future for all of humanity. The Emperor, their father, was a charlatan and a tyrant. The fire of the soul that blazed in Fulgrim when Eldred had foretold this very moment, had stated Horus had turned traitor, turned rebel. It was not there. He was influenced by the demon, of course, but it was deeper than that now. For Fulgrim had experienced things beyond his previous dreams. He had begun to have sensations at an intensity he could barely describe. It was sublime. But in all of this, the mirror that he used to mark himself by, the image he had of himself, was now turned inwards. He, like his legion, now sought perfection, not for its uses, not so they could raise up others and inspire, but as an end unto itself, the ultimate end. And that means it justified absolutely anything done in its name. For the Legion had already slid, and continued to do so at an ever-increasing rate. So it was that Fulgrim himself, not just a demonic influence, believed what Horus had to say. He knew that the Emperor had lied about beings, the warp, their boundaries, perhaps the very nature of the Primarchs themselves. So it was all too easy. He went over to Horus in an instant. It was almost too easy. And this must have worried Horus Lupercal. For the secret of Horus was that he was scared. He was not prepared. He was not confident. Perhaps this is why he got on so well with Fulgrim, because they were the same. On opposite sides of the spectrum, but the same. Fulgrim was scorned as he had no accolades, so he felt this deeply and overcompensated, rebuffing the annoyances of others who were gifted armies, whereas he had to build his own. And he was rightly proud of them for it. But this came across as arrogance. Perhaps it was. This was a shield in my mind. He was so downhearted by it all. He knew he could never catch up, even if he outshone them by 100-fold. Their trophies and battles were already stacked too high. Yet Horus was at the opposite end of the spectrum. He had fraud feelings, badly. For all that he was closest to the Emperor, longest found, most experienced and best trained of all the Primarchs, he was also preternaturally charismatic, as if born to the purple, designed to lead, even his brothers. Yet he doubted. He was always asking himself why Sanguinius was not chosen as a War Master. Why not? He also said those words as soon as Fulgrim was within whispering distance. "Have you been sent to replace me?" And he meant it. It was not just manipulation, and I honestly believe that Fulgrim could have done it, could have become War Master. So I feel that the next moves by Horus were done out of instinct, not calculation. Yet so many things people do are uncharted, are subconscious reactions to situations and triggers, and the next moments were insane. For both of them acted at odds. Fulgrim wishing to prove himself useful, or perhaps more than just useful, he offered to gain the support of the Gorgon, to try to bring Ferrus Manus over to the rebel cause, over to Horus. But Horus knew Ferrus Manus. He had been found even before Fulgrim. He had been tutored by the Emperor as well. And in my mind, Horus knew that Ferrus would never turn against the Emperor. It was as likely as Dawn or Lehman turning. It could not, would not happen. Yet Horus risked all by permitting Fulgrim to go on this mission, knowing as he did that Fulgrim was merely filled with the luster of a new cause. That Fulgrim believed that he could turn Ferrus was not in question. He believed it, because he could not imagine a world in which his closest brother was not at his side. But Horus must have known. So I believe that Horus allowed Fulgrim to go, permitted him to fail, for fail he would. And by doing this, Horus immediately negated Fulgrim as any sort of challenger to his preeminence as War Master and chosen of the Dark Guards. Yes, I do. I believe that Horus so feared what Fulgrim could be, that he knew he had to clip his wings, had to allow him to fail, so that he could not outshine Horus and be the next new love of the Chaos Guards. He took Fulgrim that seriously. The best of brothers. Now the friendship of these two was legendary. For all of the many webs of friendship, rivalry or enmity amongst the Primarchs, ever was the bond between Fulgrim and Ferrus Manus the closest, the warmest. They had met while both on Terra, Fulgrim only recently found by the Emperor. The Primarchs had so few equals that to meet one was a thing of wonder, not only to those who witnessed it, but also to the Primarchs themselves. Only they were as swift of mind of perception. A million undertones, meta-messages and subtle tales in every single movement of their face or body. The slightest shift in tone or pitch. They were like geniuses who had to talk to rocks all day, finally meeting another of their kind. But, inevitably, each would make it a test or a sparring match of one form or another. And it was no less an event when Fulgrim met Ferrus, for each touted their abilities at the forge. Ferrus could create weapons of splendor with his bare hands, it was true, but ever was Fulgrim a Feanorian level of artisan. He was simply the best at everything he put his mind to, and so they went ahead and each created a weapon of surpassing worth, of replete and vibrant power. Ferrus Manus created a sword, which he named Firebrand, and Fulgrim forged a hammer, which he called Forgebreaker. And when they were done, each proclaimed the other the master of the art, for they adored the other's skillfully crafted weapon of war. And after much bickering, they called it a draw, and they swapped weapons. And from that time onwards, Ferrus Manus would always wield the hammer Forgebreaker, and Fulgrim would always wield the sword Fireblade. This was until he found the Leia blade, which slowly seduced him. The pair was an odd coupling, for Ferrus was pragmatic, down-to-earth and functional. He could not see the worth in art, poetry or entertainment, the very things that Fulgrim so adored, so extolled as the apex of human achievement. It was such that at one point in their first meeting, Fulgrim called Ferrus a Gorgon, reflecting his bullish and prosaic perspectives on reality. Though most of the Primarchs were prickly and would have shot back at this clear derision, Ferrus was not a horror. He could see the twinkle in the eye of his brother. He could tell that the Primarchs alone could understand one another, and that his brother was testing the waters of their fast-developing friendship. And he reciprocated. He did not bluster or take truck with the statement. He laughed. And then he owned it. And henceforth he would be the first to champion its use. Ferrus was to be called the Gorgon, and the friendship of the two grew to legendary levels. Of all of the brothers, there were friendships, common cause, Yagatai and Magnus, of course, but none were as genuinely close as Ferrus and Fulgrim. Wherever possible, they would be placed in the same arenas, would support each other with real camaraderie. And their legions, so different yet so close. For the Emperor's children had been attached to the Iron Hands when not with Horus himself, due to this friendship. And it was Ferrus who seemed to understand the peacock-like Fulgrim when he was at his most petulant. Sometimes Fulgrim could be thus, but only in the presence of those he should have been able to look eye to eye with, his brothers. The small lesion effect meant he was ever and always on the back foot, always taken lightly. So he would make claims that others called wild and derided him for. When he said he could bring a world into compliance on his own, had not all of the Primarchs not done so on the worlds that they had landed on? And he did bring a world into compliance with only a bodyguard of 6 or 7 men. He did it. He broke the unbreakable. He took the snake of the lair and broke them over his knee like a toy. Yes, the casualty reports were hard, but it was done. And it was done in the way of Horus, in the way of the Crusade. It was done fast, so the Legion could recover and move forward. Could bring more worlds into imperial compliance. So the wild claims of rampant egotism are perhaps true, but they should also be tempered with the knowledge of the difficulty of the task, the import of its swift execution. Few remember that. Of course, I am leaving out as much as I am including at this point. The battle against the rogue Xenos-loving Diasporax, for one. But I need to save some details for an entry for this mighty son of the Emperor Ferrus Manus, for there is so little writ about him, for reasons we are about to see. And so, Horus agreed for Fulgrim to meet his best brother, his best friend, Ferrus. And they did. Fulgrim brought his fleet in and ensconced it within the lines of his brother's ships. There was nothing strange about Fulgrim wishing to see Ferrus, especially as they had parted so swiftly after that battle with the Diasporax, where Ferrus Manus risked his flagship to protect his brother's fire raptor. If anything, Ferrus was anxious to meet again. He probably expected a swift and awkward apology before a good natter. So the smaller Emperor's Children fleet was at point-blank range with the Iron Hand ships as the fire raptor took Fulgrim to Ferrus. They met, the pomp as large as usual. The Phoenix Guard surrounded Fulgrim, his Terminators pristine as always. They met the Morlock Guard of Ferrus. Both escorted the Primarchs as they walked to Ferrus's private quarters. The two units taking position one after the other in alternating ranks of Morlocks and Phoenix Guard. Alas, Fulgrim was so sure that his brother would see things his way, was so certain that Ferrus loved him more than even his father, the Emperor. But in this, the Layer Blade had dulled the mind of Fulgrim too much. For Ferrus Manus was of Medusa. He had been raised on a planet where honor and loyalty were all. Fulgrim could not have done worse had he attempted to seduce Rogel. He failed miserably. And despite their connection, their friendship, their history, they fought. Ferrus was enraged, as Fulgrim would have been had he not been under the dweemers of the demon, and Ferrus moved to strike Fulgrim down. The two fought, but Fulgrim was the faster, and he struck at Ferrus, who caught Fireblade in his own iron-covered hands, and he looked deep into Fulgrim's eyes as he declared that Fireblade was of his craft, and he knew how to unmake it. And with that, only inches from his own face, Ferrus broke the blade, its power exploding out and sending both at walls. Fulgrim, a tiny distance further from the origin point of the discharge, woke first. He could have slain Ferrus, who was still unconscious, yet he stayed his hand. He would not kill his brother, even now. Fulgrim turned on his heel and swept from the room. As he did so, he gave one signal to his Phoenix Guard, who in synchronization swept up their blades and decapitated the Morlock Terminators to their left. The Morlocks all died instantly. The attack, utterly unexpected, yet must have been rehearsed for there to be such efficiency. Fulgrim and his elite then pounded their way to the Fire Raptor and disembarked before any really knew what had happened. Fulgrim then ordered his fleet to open fire. The prepared ships of the Emperor's Children fleet displayed their usual accuracy and perfection, as their broadsides and lance batteries tore into the Iron Hand's capital ships, crippling many, but actually destroying few. Yet, even now, with his coat colours turned and his allegiances now revealed, still, Fulgrim did not wish to slay his brother outright. He could have maintained fire and destroyed every ship there. He could have concentrated his fire and at the very least destroyed Ferrus Manus' flagship and guaranteed his death. Yet he did not. He spared them. In the future, he might tell himself that they could not possibly be effective for years, that he had neutralized the Iron Hands totally and utterly. But deep down, he must have known this was not really true. Yes, the damage he dealt the fleet would cripple any other legion for years. But this was the Iron Hands. They made their vessels tough, knew how to repair as well as any tech adepts. They would turn this around in months, not years. Yet the deed had been done. Fulgrim left Ferrus alive, but grieving. She had been betrayed. The Emperor had been betrayed. Humanity had been betrayed. Isstvan 3. The legions of the Sons of Horus, renamed after the victory at Alinor from the Lunar Wars, the Emperor's Children, Death Guard and World Eaters were gathered, about to turn their cloth and declare their intent to the galaxy. Fulgrim had been bawled out by Horus after failing to convert Ferrus, perhaps as planned, but even so, it meant that they had little time. The Primarchs went through their rosters, the entire rolls of their legions, for they knew that there were still elements in their armies that were, and always would remain, loyal to the Emperor. They had usually been raised on Terra, had fought in the legions before their Primarchs were found, or had been attached to the Master of Mankind in previous campaigns. They would remain loyal. So they had to go. Each of the legions then sent down to the planet the companies and chapters that they knew would never support them, landing tens of thousands of Marines on the world to crush a rebellion that had never started. And after deployment, the ships in orbit launched virus bombs on the planet, attempting to wipe the Loyalists out in one fell swoop. A pity that the entire fleet were not of one mind then, for some amongst those in orbit were still loyal and horrified at what was being arranged. For firing virus bombs was not a small task. Hence they warned as many of the Marines on the surface as they could, and any who were close to shelter took it immediately. The bombing happened. The world was scrubbed clean. All life died. But there were so many Loyalist life signs remaining that the traitors had to consider this a war. Horus and the other Primarchs were preparing strategic bombardments when it was revealed that Angron, the Red Angel, the berserk Primarch of the World Eaters, had taken upon himself to go down to the planet to crush the last survivors personally, blade on blade. And the rage of Horus at this news was epic. For they all needed to now engage in a costly ground war, against the Astartes no less. And there has never been a battle more charged than that of brother against brother. So the sheer passion and rage that was displayed in the fighting was something that had never been witnessed between human warriors before, and the carnage was great. And in the middle of all of it, some of the Loyalists bent the knee. Lucius the Eternal, a name he earns later of course, was one of them, defending a segment of the palace housing most of the remaining Loyalist Emperor's children. He betrayed them, and opened the gates after tearing squads of Loyalists to pieces. His betrayal claimed all those remaining in that palace. But in all of this, what was the Phoenix doing? Only the most important task of all, the linchpin to the entire plot of Horus. For he knew that Fulgrim would be the best at whatever he was tasked to do. Despite his failure with Ferrus Manus, Fulgrim was still his most able Primarch lieutenant. So Horus pleaded with Fulgrim to create the defences that would be so important in the coming battle. A battle they simply could not lose, but a battle that needed to be performed with almost mechanical precision. For any and every casualty taken was one less man or marine to take on the warpath to Terra, to confront the Emperor on his home world, the center of the Imperium. But it would take every soldier they had to do this. Thus Fulgrim was given the defences to create, and he did. He made them as well as even a Rogel or Perturaba would have done. Excellence. The slaughter at Isstvan 3 performed, the Loyalists finally wiped out, or thought to have been. The War Master then raised his banners on Isstvan 5 and declared his cause to the entire universe. Fulgrim, Mortarion, Horus and Angron all waited for the Emperor's counter-strike. Of course, it would be orchestrated by the Praetorian Rogel Dawn, and at its head would be that redoubtable Ferrus Manus. The Drop Site Massacre. Rogel Dawn was now the de facto war master for the forces that remained loyal to the Emperor. He knew that Horus had the World Eaters, Emperor's children, and Death Guard with his own Sons of Horus. 4 legions and some of the nastiest to deal with, all led by the best Primarch in war, the one first found and most trained by the Emperor, Horus Lupercal. It would not be easy. So Dawn arrayed a formidable force to assail the position while his own legion regrouped, he sent the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Iron Hands. In the second wave would be 4 more legions. The Night Lords, despite their fall from grace, the Alpha Legion, the Iron Warriors, and a huge contingent of the Word Bearers, one of the most numerous of all legions, second only to Gulliman's Ultramarines. That would be a full 7 legions against 4, more than double the forces of the traitors, for the rebels had lost up to a third of their legions in the cleansing of Isstvan III. And on the edges of the Urgal Depression, a fortress had been constructed by Fulgrim, and there the traitors waited, arrayed for battle. The loyalist armadas firing down on the Bastille were ignored by the void shielding Fulgrim had arrayed, so the loyalists would go down to meet them. They would perform a staggered assault. The first wave would be the Iron Hands, the Raven Guard, and the Salamanders. The second wave would be the rest. With this much force in one place, there could be no hope for Horus. He had clearly gone mad. None could face this much power, surely. So the 3 initial legions dropped down to the planet across from the traitor lines, and then advanced. With Vulcan and his sons on one flank, and Corvus Corax and his Raven Guard Legion on the other, Ferrus Manus led his Iron Hands up the middle, and he was enraged. Ferrus knew that some of his brothers would hear of how Fulgrim had attempted to turn him. Thus, there was not just the rage of betrayal, not just the shock of the deed, but also a palpable slice of blame avoidance forcing his actions. He needed to show how loyal he was to his brothers, to the Emperor. So he charged the center of the Urgal Depression with an abandon that proved fatal. 1,000 of his Morlock Terminators at the front of his wedge, Ferrus smashed all before him. The lines of the traitors were holding, but barely. It was felt that the next wave would annihilate them. Had to. And thus the 4 legions of the second wave were brought down, and the 3 initial legions reacted in different ways. The Raven Guard retreated, pushing out to the flanks to permit their brethren to come forward. The Salamanders also pulled back. They had done their part, had taken the worst the War Master could throw at them, and made them bleed. It was time for the next wave to take the battle forward with fresh troops, with fresh wrath. It was an attempt also by Vulcan to share the onus or glory of this deed. Alas, Ferrus was considering his position when he caught sight of his brother, Fulgrim. He looked across the battlefield and could not miss the very obvious sign of Fulgrim, for he held the line directly before Ferrus. The vision enraged him, and he led his Morlocks on, his legion into the depths of the guns of the traitors, attempting to smash a path through to Fulgrim. But he need not have worried, for Fulgrim too spotted Ferrus, and he got up from the defences and pushed forward towards his closest friend as well. And the two met, their men dying around them in their droves. They traded initial blows, exploratory jabs and feints, but had not fully engaged when it happened. Ferrus, looking to the skies, looked at the unnumbered transports and pods of the second wave coming down. He gestured toward them and laughed in the face of his brother. He knew that they could crush Fulgrim and Horus and all of the traitors. But Fulgrim did not seem concerned. Not one jot. As the two stilled their battle for a short period to look at the reinforcements, the second wave was building their defences like mad. With Perturabo amongst them, it was efficient and effective. When the lines of the Salamanders and Raven Guard went back to their drop site, they approached the defences their brothers had made to prevent Horus from counter-attacking or breaking out, is what they all thought. But when the wounded and depleted men of the Loyalists came within range, a single flare went up from the tower of Horus's lines. As a single red fire streaked into the sky and then slowly dropped, the walls of the defences of the second wave erupted. The Night Lords, the Word Bearers, Alpha Legion and Iron Warriors then opened up. The bolters were dug in defences, the first wave in open ground directly before them. and they butchered their brothers in their throngs. Panic erupted, and the loyalist first wave legions were smashed. Forced back from the new defences toward the old, the hammer and anvil of the trap was perfect, and the legions were being wiped out with ease. Fulgrim looked to his brother Ferrus, pointing to that which was occurring, and laughed at him in return. And Ferrus knew they had all gone over to Horus. All 4 of the second wave legions had turned traitor before they even met to plan the battle. And in that instant, Ferrus could see the unmaking of all he had fought for, all he had worked for, all his sons had bled and died for. And he tried to kill the only person left that he could. He took out all of his ire on Fulgrim. Yet his brother was always underrated by his siblings. Usually Ferrus remembered this, but in his fury, he now forgot. So Fulgrim reminded him. For Fulgrim was, as I read the lore, one of the most potent of all of the Primarchs in a duel. He might not destroy as many of the enemy as Angron or Sanguinius might, yet he was lethal in 1-to-1, mano a mano. Fulgrim fought like a tiger, yet needled Ferrus all the way through, provoking the Lord of Iron to make mistakes, which, of course, inflamed with passion as he was, he did. Finally, with Ferrus Manus now beaten down on his knees, his neck open for the attack, Fulgrim seemed to come to his senses. Or was it the machinations of the demon inside the lair blade? For the fog was now lifting from his mind only at the point that he now experienced. Below him, beaten and bloodied, clutching the wounds inflicted on him, his most beloved brother knelt and looked up at him. But there was no imploring in the eyes of the Gorgon, the name he, Fulgrim, had coined first. They had been so close. But all that was in Ferrus's eyes was hatred. No pity, no understanding, no care. Just raw, unbridled hate. And it snapped Fulgrim out. He witnessed all around him, the mind-bending scale of it all, as a massacre of tens of thousands of Marines was enacted mere feet from where they stood all around them, like they were an island in a sea of woe. And it hit Fulgrim. What they had become. What he was doing. Yet he could not stop himself. He had decided not to strike, yet he watched his hand as if it was someone else's. He saw the lair blade come down, as if held by another who inhabited the spot on which he stood, and he could not stop it. And when the blade ended its arc, when the blood spattered from its tip across the ground, it was followed by a dull, muffled thud, barely audible over the cacophony around them. It was the sound of Ferrus Manus's head hitting the ground. As Fulgrim looked on, the head of Ferrus rolled to a stop, its eyes still looking at him in hate, eternal hate. And the scales were finally utterly and totally lifted from Fulgrim's eyes. Like the curse of Morgoth upon Hurin, the evil that he had witnessed and ignored, the horror of the last months, it all came crashing down on him. I have not discussed the depravity of the Emperor's children in all of this time, because Fulgrim was so enamoured, so enwrapped with himself and his goals, with his legend, that he did not once take real stock, even as things happened before his very eyes. The thing inside the lair blade confounded his mind, twisted his sensibilities, so that it seemed practically run-of-the-mill, normal. Nothing to rebuke or rebel over. It was as it should be. But now, the blood oozing from the stump of his most beloved brother's body, as it fell forward onto his knees, he could not avoid seeing what they had become. It had all been so slow, the path to perfection, the road to hell, taken one tiny shuffling step at a time. Fabius Bile, the apothecarian, had been experimenting on his brothers. He'd begun by trying to make them better at war. It was all another step to perfection. The integration of layered voice boxes and cords to Marines. They could now screech and shatter the eardrums of their enemies. If close enough, they could burst their eyes and organs, the force destroying skeletons. Yet it had descended over the time. Until Fabius Bile was no longer seeking merely to improve the Marines, but to snatch the keys to heaven itself. He experimented not to improve the person on his slab, but to garner as many secrets from them as he could. He rendered down entire populations of freighters for narcotics that were initially to boost the efficiency and reactions of the Emperor's children. And at first, they had been taken by volunteers. Eventually, these combat drugs were taken as standard, ordered to be consumed. Then later, they had descended into being narcotics for recreation and edification. The highs were staggering. But the price was untold tens of thousands of sentient beings. Beings of their own race. The Emperor's children, who were meant to be shining beacons of what was best in the Astartes, best in the Crusade, the best of humanity. They had become butchers as bad as the Lair and other Xenos horrors that they had sallied forth to destroy. They had gone from being saviors to being base, vile slaughterers. And what they had done to the fleet. The insanity and excess that had swept the entire expedition was ghastly. The artists that had made garish horrors out of their own bodily fluids then degenerated into murder and using the fluids of their victims as the colours for their canvas. The great Bekwa Kinska had created new instruments, had attempted to replicate the droning cacophony she had heard in the Temple of Leren, and she had made it happen. It had all happened in a place called La Fenice, the performance and carousing area of the flagship that was for the remembrancers. The great composer invited all to attend her first performance, both civilian and Primarch and Marine alike. When the strange and terrifying music reached its crescendo, it was proof of the link between the lair and the warp. For it tore open space and demons of Slaanesh cavorted through the portal. The insanity bled into reality and only augmented the feelings that were rife. The Emperor's children taking over the instruments from those mortal performers who had burst and demonettes come from them, and they played the instruments like they were weapons, scything their waves of music into the crowds of mortals and watching them explode or vibrate into non-existence, their molecules simply falling apart. The enhanced amongst the Emperor's children added their own voices to this macabre music, and more innocents died, their heads practically exploding. And this was the birth of the Noise Marines, their first outing. And Fulgrim now saw it all, as if it had just happened for the first time. The ultimate cruelty from the thing inside the blade, for the Primarchs had perfect recall. They could remember a summer breeze on their faces with the exact smell of the pollen on a morning hundreds of years before. When they remembered an event, it missed no nuance, was party to no rewriting or deterioration. So when the scales were lifted, the demon retracting its influence, the good and pure Fulgrim, the hero of the Crusade, the best of brothers, with the most ardent and well-trained army that humanity had ever known, the lord of silver hair and silken tongue, the man who wanted to raise all of humanity up as far as they would go. He saw what his sons had become. He witnessed their mutations, their horrific sonic attacks, and the glee with which they annihilated the Morlocks, the last of Ferris's guard. And he saw they were things of nightmare. Distended jaws for screaming like banshees, wings and claws and teeth among those possessed. It was like a scene from hell. And the worst of it all, the body at his feet. The precious blood of his most loved brother now caked his very boots. Fulgrim looked on, and finally openly wept. He was broken. And then, when there was nothing left, nowhere he could run to, no way to avoid the repercussion of his own fall, for all of it had happened because of him. He had not led his men, had not protected them from evil. He had not stopped them devolve into barbarism, had not lifted a finger. Worse, he had been at its centre. He could not have defended them from a threat they were never told about. The Emperor, their father, had never warned them about. He had sent them as lambs to the slaughter. So even now, even when he was clear of mind and soul, even now, Fulgrim could not forgive the Emperor. For their father had forsaken them. Horus was right. But the cost. Look at what they had become. What evil they now performed. Worse than any tyrant or Xenos they had crushed in the crusade. And it broke Fulgrim. It broke him so much that he accepted a dire offer. For the demon in the blade sensed his weakness, his sorrow, his wish to end it all. And he offered to make it all go away, for Fulgrim to rest forever, to never have to feel the sting of his actions, the pain of his deeds. Looking down at his brother, up at his sons, Fulgrim chose oblivion. And in that second, when he opened himself to the demon, it leapt at the chance. Fulgrim was no more. The Primarch that remained was him in body only. His spirit was locked away from his body in the portrait writ in blood and feces on the wall of La Fenice. The demon now possessed Fulgrim's body and led his legion. Now there is so much more about this Primarch, this tragic figure. I have left out as much as I have outlined, if not more so. Yet from here, I do not consider this Fulgrim. I know that in the book the mirror cracked. He escapes his captivity, he reclaims his body. Then he goes on to become a demon Primarch, an angel exterminatus. And it is by his hand that his brother Reboot was struck down. A planet all of his own to rule in the warp. But this is quite a journey unto itself. And a tale for another time. So let us sum up. Of all of the legions or Primarchs that fell to chaos, I believe that of Fulgrim and the Emperor's children to be the most monstrous, the greatest loss. The most barbaric of desecrations that could have been only matched should Sanguinius himself have fallen. For the other Primarchs that felt enhanced, augmented, they and their legions were made more. They became more of what they already were. The World Eaters became more savage, the Death Guard more resilient, the Thousand Suns more mystically powerful. But chaos destroyed the Emperor's children. It did not enhance that which was there, for it was the twisted mirror image, its opposite. So it destroyed the Emperor's children, as it did their lord. Everything they were, everything they had done, everything they could have been. A quest for perfection. Many have taken this road. All have failed. But was it really that at all? Perfection is the obsessive name of that greatest of all drives, merely taken to an unhealthy extent. The purest, the most noble of drives. To be better. To leave the world a better place than you entered it. And that is what the Emperor's children stood for. It is what Fulgrim was born to do. To raise people up. Fulgrim was one of the most potent of the Primarchs, one of the best. So much that he could have been War Master, had his legion been larger. Had the Blight not wiped out the seeds that made his men, and the Council of Terror agreed with this. Of all of the Primarchs they could have sent, the loyal wolf, the successful and martial lion, the angel himself? No. The council sent Fulgrim. For he was on hand, fair enough, but he was also one of the few who could have taken Horus to task, could have replaced him if need be. They showed that much faith in the abilities of the Palatine Phoenix, like a more mature angel. And it is his loss, more than any other, more than Mortarion, Angron, Alfarius, Perturabo, Lorgar, or Conrad, that must have been felt so keenly, would have actually wounded the Emperor, his self-image. For only Horus and Magnus were greater losses, only they, and only due to Horus being found so much earlier than Fulgrim. If the Crusade had taken a different course, if their landing planets had been swapped, then surely Fulgrim would have been War Master. Weep. Weep for what the Imperium has lost, what the human race has had snatched from us. One of our greatest lights. Hate to the dark gods of chaos for what they have done. For taking from us the Palatine Phoenix. From taking from us the perfect one. From taking from us Fulgrim. This video has been made in collaboration with HORUS HERESY LEGIONS, links in the description. So if you wish to command the Emperor's children, or Fulgrim himself, to see how you would fare on that most bloody of all battlefields, the Urgal Depression, the Drop Site Massacre, then download the game and get stuck in. See you there. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Like playing HORUS HERESY LEGIONS.